Hey guys, tonight we're going to do that thing we always do, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little tighter, pretend your phone screen glow is a medieval lantern, and let's talk about a place, an empire technically, but not the shiny kind with Caesar statues and tourist merch. No, this is one of those empires that history mostly filed under miscellaneous. It's the kind of empire your high school history teacher never mentioned. The kind of empire that made a big deal of itself for a few centuries, and then collapsed so quietly that even historians squint at the footnotes like, wait, who? That, my sleepless friend, is exactly the sort of story you need at 2 a.m. A forgotten empire. Weird rulers, a little dynastic inbreeding. More than enough awkward family drama, and all told in a calm, slow voice, so you can drift off before the messy politics even make sense. So, let's wander back in time. Imagine the map of the world. Not the tidy Google Maps version, but the old medieval one with sea monsters in the ocean and way too many cities crammed into Asia. Somewhere between the mighty obvious powers, Rome, Persia, China, there sat this little empire puffing itself up like a royal pigeon. And like most royal pigeons, it thought it was far more important than anyone else did. A place between giants. The first thing to know about forgotten empires is this. They usually live in bad neighbourhoods. Not like bad in the modern sense, but in the historical sense. Wedged between bigger, scarier neighbours. You know, the kind that like to borrow territory the way your cousin borrows your hoodie and never gives it back. This empire was sandwiched between two heavyweights. On one side, a sprawling dynasty with shiny palaces. On the other side, a war machine that ate provinces for breakfast. And in the middle sat our little empire, trying to look important while nervously checking both borders. To make things worse, the place was kind of geographically cursed. Too hot, too dry, not enough rivers. The kind of land where crops give up halfway, and kings start building temples because divine intervention feels easier than irrigation. But they tried. Oh, they tried. The founding king. Now, every forgotten empire has a founding king, usually some guy who overestimated himself after one decent battle. Our founding king was no exception. Let's call him King Overconfident I, because of course he was. According to the chronicles, which, by the way, were written by monks who clearly had a flair for exaggeration, he won a great victory over some nomads. What this actually meant was probably he survived an ambush and declared it divine destiny. But hey, in the ancient world that was enough to crown yourself emperor. So he did, and he wore the crown like a man who thought he invented monarchy. He built a palace, which was mostly mud bricks and wishful thinking. He declared a capital city, which was really just a glorified village with a wall. And he started a dynasty, which, well, let's just say family trees in this empire ended up looking more like family bushes. Royal weirdness begins early. The first royal quirk, naming. For some reason, every king in this dynasty thought it was hilarious to recycle the same two names, so the line went something like overconfident, ambitious, overconfident 2, ambitious 2, and so on. Imagine trying to remember which one raised taxes and which one accidentally lost half the army. Even their own scribes gave up. One chronicle literally says, "This king, whose name is the same as his father's, did not accomplish much. Thanks, monk. That clears it right up." Another delightful quirk. They loved titles. Not content with king, these guys went all in. Lord of the Four Quarters, Master of the Heavens, chosen by the sun, owner of probably too many goats. Okay, I made that last one up, but honestly it wouldn't surprise me. Marriage, inbreeding, and the usual royal mess. And because no bedtime history is complete without family drama, oh boy did they deliver. The royal marriage strategy was, let's call it lazy. Instead of reaching out for shiny foreign princesses, they just married cousins. Then cousins of cousins. Then nieces. At one point, one king managed to be his own uncle-in-law. Don't think about it too hard. The result? Generations of rulers with more genetic recycling than a medieval compost heap. By the 3rd century of this dynasty, portraits of kings started looking suspiciously identical, which, to be fair, made it easier for artists. Does the king have the family nose? Yep. Great. Paint the same guy again. Religion as a distraction. Now, when your empire is small, your crops are failing, and your royal bloodline is starting to resemble a Mobius strip, what do? You build temples. Lots of them. The kings of this empire went on a construction spree. Shrines, altars, statues, you name it. One king in particular, let's call him Ambitious III, declared that the gods had personally chosen his dynasty to rule forever, which is always a bold claim, especially when your empire is roughly the size of a modern county. But the people went along with it, mostly because the alternative was taxes, and so religion became the glue. The temples were the Wi-Fi of the empire, always under maintenance, occasionally working, and everyone pretending they understood the connection. The empire nobody took seriously. Here's the ironic bit. For centuries this empire puffed itself up with titles, ceremonies and divine proclamations, and yet the neighbours barely noticed. When the big powers drew maps, they didn't even bother labelling this place. Sometimes they just scribbled tribes or other people. Imagine ruling for 400 years and still being listed as miscellaneous. Brutal. Even worse, when foreign envoys did visit, they treated the kings like side quests. Yes, great king, we acknowledge your divine status. Now please send us grain and stop blocking our trade routes. And the kings? They wrote these encounters down as if they were diplomatic triumphs. One tablet proudly records, "The mighty empire of the West has recognised my greatness and sent 3 donkeys. 3 donkeys. Truly, the height of prestige." Let's float over to another royal disaster in part 2, where the kings get even stranger, the temples get taller, and the empire starts realising that obscurity is harder to shake than enemies. So, let's pick up where we left off. We're still drifting through this empire that most of your history teachers conveniently skipped, because honestly, even they didn't want to bother remembering it. Tonight we'll poke around its royal courts, its slightly delusional rulers, and the kind of policies that made sure the whole thing was basically doomed before it began. Now, when you picture an emperor, you probably imagine some powerful figure in golden robes, issuing commands with thunder in his voice. But in the case of our forgotten empire, most of its rulers were more, let's say, eccentric than effective. One liked to collect exotic birds more than taxes. Another thought poetry contests were a valid military strategy. Yes, you heard that right. Actual wars were paused so he could compare rhymes. Spoiler. His army didn't rhyme nearly as well as the enemy's swords, and this wasn't unusual. Their kings and queens were often born into what we'd politely call a genetic mess. Marrying cousins was practically a national sport, and it showed. The portraits that remain, if you can trust them, feature jawlines that didn't quite match, eyes that drifted in opposite directions, and regal noses that seemed determined to outgrow the rest of their faces. But of course the official record would tell you they were all stunningly handsome, which is medieval speak for. Please don't look too closely. Now, before you drift too far off to sleep, let's stroll into one of their most famous royal scandals. There was this one crown prince. Let's call him Prince Definitely Not Ready. He spent most of his reign throwing feasts that lasted weeks, while the treasury leaked money faster than wine out of a tipped goblet. His advisors begged him to stop, but he apparently thought the best way to fix financial ruin was to build a bigger palace. Because of course, what better way to inspire the peasants than by showing them a house they'd never get past the front gate? Naturally, the empire's subjects weren't impressed. Farmers were stuck in endless cycles of famine, while the court debated what kind of silk curtains would best match the throne room. And still, somehow, nobody thought this was a recipe for collapse. It's almost impressive, really. The ability to ignore a burning house while arguing over the colour of the wallpaper. Let's float now into another delightful royal quirk: their obsession with omens. You see, these rulers believed practically everything was a sign. A comet? Clearly a message from the gods. A bird landing on the palace roof? Definitely an omen of prosperity. A servant sneezing during dinner? Well, guess the crops will fail this year. Whole policies were changed because someone spotted a funny-looking cloud. If you ever wonder why the empire didn't last, remember, half its laws were basically written by the weather forecast. But here's the thing. Despite the incompetence, despite the bizarre habits, despite the fact that the royal family tree looked more like a tangled vine, this empire did manage to leave behind some impressive ruins. Crumbling palaces, half-buried temples, inscriptions in a script nobody quite bothered to translate correctly. It all whispers of grandeur that was almost real. Almost. Like someone tried to build Rome, but ended up with a discount version where half the columns didn't line up. Let's wander further into the family drama though, because what's an empire without disastrous royal children? One king had 7 sons, and he gave each of them a tiny piece of the kingdom to practice ruling. Cute idea, right? Like giving your kids training wheels. Except instead of learning, they immediately started fighting each other. Within a few years, the empire was more like a very large family argument, complete with burned villages and backstabbing uncles. Honestly, you'd get more stability out of a modern reality show. And still, the official chronicles tried to paint this chaos as divine order. According to the palace scribes, every disaster was actually part of a grand cosmic plan, which is basically medieval spin doctoring. If the crops fail, it's not because of bad irrigation, it's because the gods were just testing everyone's patience. If the army lost a battle, it wasn't poor strategy, it was destiny. Very convenient for the royal PR department, though I doubt the peasants sleeping on empty stomachs felt particularly reassured. By this point, if you're thinking, wow, this empire sounds kind of doomed, well, yes, you're absolutely right. But the beauty of bedtime history is that we don't rush to the ending. We glide through every odd detail, every peculiar custom, every mismanaged treasury and awkward royal wedding, until the whole picture of collapse just sort of quietly unfolds. So let's stay here a little longer, wandering these forgotten palace halls. Imagine the flicker of torches against cracked walls, the smell of incense mixed with mildew, the echo of half-drunk nobles arguing about who gets the last piece of roast lamb. This was daily life at the height of the empire. Chaotic, indulgent, and already beginning to rot from the inside out. And yet, in some strange way, that's exactly why we remember it. Not because it was great, but because it was human, messy, flawed, and slightly ridiculous. Just like most of history's so-called great empires. Let's float gently forward into the next royal disaster. So here we are, deeper into the twilight years of this empire that no one remembers, but everyone probably should. And if you've been thinking, surely they must have had at least one halfway competent ruler, well, not really. Their version of stability usually meant slightly less chaos than usual, which, to be fair, is better than open revolt. But still, not exactly a golden age. Let's start with one emperor who could have been promising. He was young, he was educated, he actually knew how to read, which, believe it or not, wasn't a given for royalty at the time. People got excited. Finally, a ruler who might steer the empire into something resembling order. And then, he got obsessed with astrology. Entire state policies were determined by where Mars and Jupiter happened to be hanging out in the sky. Crops failing, must be Mercury's fault. Soldiers deserting. Clearly Saturn was in a mood. Needless to say, things didn't exactly improve. And then came the marriages. Oh, the marriages. Royal unions in this empire were less about love and more about strategic face palms. Cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, sometimes even stepmother to stepson. Because why not double down on genetic roulette? And of course, each of these marriages was celebrated as if it were the key to eternal prosperity. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Instead, you ended up with heirs who could barely stand upright without medical assistance, and dynasties that looked less majestic and more shaky Jenga tower. Take one queen, for example. She was technically married to the emperor, but spent most of her life writing passive-aggressive letters to her in-laws. She also kept a collection of pet monkeys, which she insisted be treated with the same respect as foreign ambassadors. Imagine being a visiting diplomat, dressed in your finest robes, only to be introduced to a monkey in a miniature crown. Sleepy, yes. Respectable, not so much. But it wasn't just the royals who were eccentric. The bureaucracy was equally a mess. Officials were appointed based on who brought the emperor the fanciest gifts, rather than, say, who was qualified. This meant the tax collectors often couldn't count, and the judges couldn't read. Court cases dragged on for decades, and entire villages vanished from tax records because someone spilled ink on the scroll. Efficiency was not their strong suit. Let's float now to their military, which was, on paper, intimidating. In reality, though, most of the empire's generals spent more time arguing about uniforms than strategy. They did manage the occasional victory, but usually by accident, like when the enemy got lost in the desert and half-starved before the battle even began. Naturally, these flukes were written down as glorious triumphs. The chroniclers always knew how to spin things, and speaking of chroniclers, this empire's historians were masters of exaggeration. According to them, every king was wise beyond all men, and every queen was the jewel of the earth. Meanwhile, peasants were selling their children to survive famine. But hey, the scrolls had to make things sound good. It's the ancient version of Instagram. Show the highlights. Hide the mess. One of the more tragicomic moments came with Emperor Let's Build Everything. He poured the treasury into massive monuments, palaces, temples and gardens that looked stunning, but drained the state coffers dry. Imagine living in a leaky hut while your taxes funded a marble bathhouse for the royal pigeons. Because yes, they built one. Even pigeons got better living conditions than the average citizen. And yet somehow people tolerated this. Maybe because complaining too loudly tended to shorten your life expectancy. Or maybe because deep down everyone kind of believed in the myth of grandeur, that if the empire looked impressive enough, maybe it really was. The cracked columns, the half-finished statues, the empty granaries, all covered by a thin layer of gold paint. Now no empire is complete without rebellions, and this one had plenty. Peasants rising up because they were tired of famine. Nobles plotting against each other because someone didn't get invited to the right feast. Armies switching sides mid-battle because the other king offered slightly better wine. The whole place was basically a soap opera, but with more dust and fewer commercial breaks. And yet, here's the part I find oddly comforting. Even in the middle of all this, life went on. People still married, still told stories, still dreamed of better days. Empires collapse, but the quiet, ordinary lives beneath them just keep flowing, like water slipping around a crumbling stone. That's the strange, sleepy rhythm of history. It never really stops, even when kings do. So let's keep drifting. Ahead lies the empire's slow unravelling. More royal disasters, more questionable decisions, and finally, the gentle slide into being forgotten. So, by now, our forgotten empire has gone through enough disasters to qualify as a case study in how not to run a kingdom. And yet, somehow, it still kept stumbling forward. Empires are like that. They don't collapse all at once. They linger. They drag themselves along like that one guest at the party who refuses to leave even though the music stopped hours ago. By this point, the throne had passed through so many shaky hands it was hard to keep track. Cousins dethroned cousins, uncles stole crowns from nephews. At one point, they even had two emperors at the same time, because apparently the people just couldn't get enough chaos. Imagine trying to collect taxes when one emperor says, "Give me the money," and the other says, "No, give it to me instead." Spoiler, the peasants kept it for themselves. The royal court was no better. Factions formed around which prince had the best chance of surviving his own poor health. Some were chronically sick, others hopelessly spoiled, and one had the unfortunate habit of fainting every time someone mentioned battle, which honestly might have been the most relatable trait in the whole dynasty. And then there were the queens. Oh, the queens. Some were power players scheming behind the scenes, others were basically glorified scapegoats. One poor queen was blamed for a famine simply because she happened to eat a pomegranate in public the same year the crops failed. The logic was, she angered the gods by enjoying fruit, which, you have to admit, is a very creative stretch. Meanwhile, the empire's infrastructure was crumbling. Roads fell apart, trade routes collapsed, and bridges washed away in floods. But instead of fixing them, the rulers doubled down on luxury projects. More palaces, more golden thrones. At one point they even commissioned a jewelled coffin for a king who wasn't dead yet. Priorities, clearly. And then came the advisors, always whispering, always plotting. Some promoted strange new religions, others promised miracle cures for the royal family's growing list of genetic problems. Spoiler, none of them worked. But that didn't stop emperors from pouring fortunes into alchemists who claimed they could turn lead into gold or cure inbreeding with potions. Neither happened. Let's drift to one particularly awkward episode, the empire's attempt at diplomacy. They sent an ambassador to a neighbouring kingdom with gifts, fine silks, spices, and yes, another monkey and a crown. The neighbours weren't impressed. They sent the gifts back, along with a polite note that basically said, "Try again when you're serious." Diplomacy wasn't exactly their strong suit. Still, the empire tried to project confidence. Public ceremonies continued. Parades marched through streets that were literally crumbling. Priests proclaimed divine favour even as temples fell into disrepair. It was all theatre. Grand, glittering, exhausting theatre. And the people watched, half believing, half rolling their eyes as if to say, "Sure, fine, maybe the gods love us, but when's the bread coming?" By this stage, rebellions became more frequent. Whole provinces drifted away, deciding they'd rather fend for themselves than deal with the chaos at the capital. The empire shrank piece by piece like a sandcastle slowly washed away by the tide. But of course, the official scribes insisted it was all temporary. "We are still the greatest empire," they wrote, even as their territory shrank to something barely bigger than a large city-state. And yet, here's the funny thing. People still clung to the idea of empire. There's something comforting about believing your kingdom is eternal, even when it's clearly not. It's like keeping a broken clock on the wall because it looks nice, even though you know it'll never tell the right time again. So, the empire limped on. Rulers came and went. The treasury emptied and refilled, then emptied again. The people endured as people always do, and slowly, quietly, almost without anyone noticing, the empire slipped into obscurity, not with a bang, not even with a whimper, just a long drawn-out sigh, which honestly makes it perfect for bedtime history. Let's float now into its final collapse. So here we are, the last stretch, the empire's end. Though, to be honest, calling it the end feels a bit dramatic. Empires don't fall off a cliff, they just slowly deflate, like a balloon left in the corner after a party. Still technically a balloon, but saggy, wrinkled, and kind of sad to look at. By now, the once proud rulers were more like caretakers of ruins. Their palaces leaked. Their armies, when they even showed up, were made up of underpaid mercenaries who were just as likely to switch sides mid-battle as fight. Taxes weren't collected so much as begged for. And the people? Well, most had already moved on emotionally. It's hard to stay loyal when your empire gives you famine, crumbling roads, and royal family drama that makes reality TV look dignified. The last emperors weren't great leaders. They were more like placeholders. One was obsessed with hunting, to the point that he literally abandoned the capital during a siege because he heard there were better deer in the countryside. Another spent his reign commissioning statues of himself, most of which were toppled before the paint even dried. It's almost impressive in a way how consistent their poor judgment was. Let's float to the final straw. foreign invasions. Neighbouring kingdoms, who had spent centuries watching this empire stumble around, finally decided enough was enough. Armies marched in, expecting a fight. But instead of epic battles, they found half-empty cities and garrisons that surrendered on sight. Some towns even opened their gates willingly, figuring the invaders couldn't possibly be worse than their own rulers, which tells you everything you need to know. And then there was the capital itself. Once a glittering jewel, now a crumbling husk. Its walls were cracked, its markets empty, its fountains dry. When the enemy finally arrived, they didn't storm it with fire and fury, they just walked in. The defenders had given up, the emperor had fled, and the people barely lifted an eyebrow. After all, what was one more change of rulers in a lifetime of disappointments? Of course, the chroniclers couldn't admit this. So they wrote about signs in the heavens, divine punishments, and noble sacrifices. They made the fall sound tragic, even poetic. But the truth was simpler. The empire had been falling for centuries. By the time it finally collapsed, most people probably just shrugged and went back to their daily lives, and that's the strange, sleepy beauty of it. Empires rise with fanfare, but they rarely fall with drama. More often, they fade, slowly, quietly, like a candle burning down to its last flicker. Forgotten not because they weren't important, but because life simply moved on. Today, what's left of this empire are ruins and half-remembered stories. Stones that once held up palaces now lie scattered in fields, inscriptions in a language no one fully understands, broken pottery, shards of gold leaf, a few statues whose noses have all mysteriously gone missing. Archaeologists poke at the remains, piecing together fragments, while tourists wander through, snapping photos before heading back to the bus. And somewhere in those ruins, you can still feel the echo of it all, the grandeur that wasn't quite real, the kings who thought they were eternal, the queens who blamed fruit for famine, the people who endured. It's all still there if you squint hard enough, or if you listen long enough, lying in bed, half asleep. So here, at the end of this forgotten empire, let's just sit for a moment. Picture the broken columns glowing in the moonlight. Imagine the silence of streets that once bustled with life, and let the memory of it all drift into your dreams, because history, like sleep, always comes back around. And tomorrow night, there will be another empire to wander through, another disaster to quietly retell, another story to end your night. So, the empire's gone, collapsed, done, kaput. But as with all things human, it didn't just vanish neatly like a magic trick. Pieces of it stuck around. And here's where things actually get kind of funny. People forgot this empire so thoroughly that when archaeologists stumbled across its ruins centuries later, they were like, wait, who lived here again? The remains were impressive enough. Massive walls, toppled temples, strange inscriptions in scripts no one could read. But the problem with being forgotten is that there's no instruction manual left behind. The later civilizations who wandered past just shrugged and made up stories. Some said giants had built the cities. Others claimed the ruins were left by gods, half-finished construction projects abandoned when divine funding ran out. Honestly, that explanation makes as much sense as any government budget I've seen. For local farmers, the ruins were just inconvenient. Giant stones sticking out of their fields, perfect for stealing building materials but otherwise not great for ploughing. Imagine living next to what was once a royal palace and deciding, you know what? That corner column would make a great foundation for my chicken coop, and that's basically what happened. The empire's grandeur turned into cottage walls, millstones and fences, recycling before recycling was trendy. Fast forward to the age of explorers and amateur historians. They rediscovered the ruins like wide-eyed kids stumbling into a forgotten attic. Except instead of dusty photo albums, they found colossal statues with no heads, broken pottery painted with faded gods, and tablets filled with writing that looked like doodles from someone's really bored math class. Cue endless debates. Who were these people? Where did they go? Did they even matter? And here's the twist. This forgotten empire actually influenced way more than people realised. Even while it was collapsing, its ideas, laws, architecture, even random agricultural tricks were quietly borrowed by its neighbours. Those neighbours passed the ideas along, claimed them as their own, and pretty soon nobody remembered the original source. Classic plagiarism, ancient addition. Imagine inventing the wheel, and then centuries later, people just assume it was someone else's idea because you didn't stick around long enough to file the patent. The royal bloodlines? They didn't vanish either. Turns out some of those inbred potato princes had cousins and grandkids who slipped into neighbouring courts. So if you trace the family trees of later European or Asian dynasties, you sometimes find a ghostly connection to this empire. Like an embarrassing uncle at a wedding, they're technically there, but nobody really wants to talk about them. By the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeology became slightly less about treasure hunting and more about science, scholars pieced together the fragments. Slowly, the empire's story re-emerged. Well, sort of. There are still massive gaps, missing centuries, whole rulers we know only by a single cracked inscription, laws we can't fully translate. But that's the charm. A forgotten empire is like a half-remembered dream. You never quite see the full picture, and maybe that's why it's so haunting. And then, of course, modern tourism showed up. Now those ruins that once sheltered goats and chickens are surrounded by souvenir stands and ticket booths. Tour guides wave flags, reciting semi-accurate history in 10 languages, while visitors snap selfies against crumbling walls. Imagine explaining to the ancient emperors that their great legacy would one day be a backdrop for Instagram influencers. They'd probably cry, or laugh, or both. But here's the thing, the empire isn't really forgotten anymore. Not entirely. It lives on in museum displays, in dusty books no one reads, and in bedtime stories like this one. People might not remember the emperor's names or the details of their fall, but they'll remember the vibe, something once mighty, now gone. A reminder that even the biggest egos eventually end up as rubble under someone's sandals. And maybe that's the real bedtime lesson tonight. Empires aren't forever. Kings aren't immortal. Queens can't actually control the weather, no matter how much they yell at their fruit baskets. Everything fades, but the echoes remain, soft enough to lull you to sleep, strange enough to keep the historians busy, and ironic enough to make us smile in the dark. So, as you drift off, imagine walking through those ruins under a pale moon. The stones are cold, the air is quiet, and somewhere in the distance you can almost hear the whispers of a forgotten people. Not tragic, not heroic, just human. And that's more than enough. So here we are, at the edge of the story. The empire is long gone, buried in sand and silence. Its rulers nothing more than names etched on stones half erased by time. And yet, for an hour and a half, we've been wandering through their world. Palaces that smelled of incense and sweat. Royal families arguing over who gets the shinier crown, and priests insisting that the gods demanded just one more sacrifice. Because, of course, they did. It's funny, isn't it? How much noise they made in their own time. Decrees shouted across cities, armies clashing on open plains, royal marriages sealed with parades and banquets that lasted weeks. They were convinced of their permanence. They couldn't imagine a world without them. And yet, the world moved on. It always does. Now they're just ruins. Quiet, hollow shells. Tourists step on the same stones where kings once walked, and pigeons roost in what used to be throne rooms. And maybe that's the humbling part. No matter how much power you gather, no matter how many statues you carve of yourself, eventually you too become a background for someone else's photo album. And honestly, that's kind of comforting, because if even emperors end up forgotten, then the rest of us don't need to stress so much about our own little failures. Didn't do the laundry today? Missed a deadline? Relax. Entire civilizations have been lost for centuries and the Earth is still spinning. Your to-do list can wait. Let's not dress it up. History is basically one long story of people thinking they're special, only for time to shrug and sweep them into obscurity. But when we slow down enough to notice, those faint echoes, broken tablets, crumbling walls, the gossip of long-dead royals, become something soothing. A reminder that all the noise of today will someday be just a whisper too. So, as you're lying there in the dark, listening, maybe letting your eyes finally drift shut, imagine that quiet, the ruins at night, a forgotten empire under the stars, a place where the only sound is the wind brushing against stone. Nobody's yelling, nobody's fighting for the throne, just silence. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. A story of power, collapse and memory, told softly enough to let you slip into dreams. Sleep well, my friend. History will still be here tomorrow. So, we've walked through palaces, markets, temples and tombs. We've met kings who thought they'd live forever, and priests who acted like the universe depended on whether or not they burned the right incense on the right day. But before we wrap this journey up, let's just pause a little longer. History doesn't rush, so neither will we. Let's think about what really survives from an empire. Spoiler, it's not usually the stuff they cared about most. Rulers obsessed over their armies, their wealth, their monuments. But centuries later, what slips through is often smaller, stranger, almost accidental. A recipe scratched onto a broken shard of pottery. A lullaby that mothers kept singing, even when the language itself was on the verge of extinction. A symbol carved in the corner of a wall, maybe by some bored scribe who thought no one would ever notice. These things outlast entire dynasties. Which is ironic, because kings built statues 30 feet tall, and now they're toppled and headless. But the lullabies, they still echo in languages that carry faint traces of the old world. It makes you wonder, what will actually survive from us? Not the stuff we think. Probably not our big speeches or endless online arguments. More likely, it'll be some ridiculous meme or a half-forgotten song lyric. Imagine an archaeologist 2,000 years from now, digging up a USB stick and finding nothing but a folder labelled dog memes. And you know what? That would be fair. That's about as representative of us as anything. But back to the forgotten empire. Imagine the end for the ordinary people. Not the kings and generals, but the farmers, the cooks, the ones who actually kept the empire alive. For them, the collapse wasn't some dramatic fall. It was slower, crops failing, taxes rising, armies not coming back from the frontier. And then one day, you realise the empire isn't there anymore. Not because it exploded, but because it just stopped showing up. That's the strange comfort in studying history this way. It pulls you out of the myth of sudden endings. Things drift. They fade. Empires don't vanish in one night, and neither do your worries. They just dissolve, piece by piece, until they're only half remembered. Picture this. The last temple in the empire, once filled with golden statues and chanting priests, now quiet. The paint is peeling. The roof is cracked. A goat wanders in because nobody's guarding it anymore. And honestly, that goat is probably the happiest character in this whole story. That's the irony. The empire may crumble, but life continues in small, ordinary ways. People plant gardens among the ruins. Kids play where soldiers once marched. Birds nest in palaces. What was once the heart of the world becomes a backdrop for everyday life. And maybe that's the most peaceful ending of all. So as you lie there, listening in the dark, think of yourself walking through those ruins. The stones are cool under your hands. The stars look exactly like they did for them centuries ago. And for a moment you can almost hear the faint echoes, not of battles, not of royal decrees, but of laughter, footsteps, quiet lives that somehow mattered. And then, silence. The kind of silence that fills the night and lets you finally drift. By now the empire is gone. We've followed it from its noisy birth to its quiet collapse. But before we let it slip completely into silence, let's linger a little longer in the twilight. Because history, like sleep, doesn't end with a snap. It fades, slowly. Imagine the last people who still remembered its name. Old men and women who told their grandchildren, "When I was young, this land belonged to the great empire." The kids would probably roll their eyes, just like kids do today when grandparents talk about how much cheaper everything used to be. But for that older generation, it wasn't just memory. It was a world they once walked through, and with every passing year, fewer and fewer people remembered, until one day, nobody did. The empire became like a dream you wake up from, clear for a moment, then slipping through your fingers until you can't even recall the details. Was it real? Did it matter? Yes and no. That's how history works. Civilizations are like sandcastles. You build them proudly, decorate them, guard them like they'll last forever. But the tide doesn't argue. It just comes in, slowly, gently, endlessly, and the castle is gone. But here's the thing. Even as it disappears, it leaves traces. A broken wall here, a story there, a word that sneaks into another language, a shard of pottery that somehow survives centuries under the soil. History doesn't fully vanish, it lingers like a whisper, and maybe that's why these stories feel so calming. Because in the end, we're all just whispers too, and there's comfort in knowing that it's okay to fade. The empire did, the kings did, the priest did, and the world kept spinning. So tonight, let yourself fade too. Let your thoughts drift the way ruins crumble. Let your worries sink the way palaces sink into sand. Let your mind wander out of the empire, across the desert, into the quiet stars. And if you're still awake, well, don't worry, the story's still here. And we've got one last part before we finally close the book. And now, here we are, the last page of this story. The empire we've wandered through has completely faded, its kings forgotten, its temples crumbled, its songs silenced. And yet, for a little while, it was alive again, in our words, in our imagination, in the quiet journey we've just taken together. It's strange, isn't it? How something so powerful, so certain of its own permanence, can be reduced to ruins and whispers. But that's history's quiet joke. The louder the empire was in its own time, the quieter it becomes in ours, and there's comfort in that. Because if even kings and queens with all their crowns and palaces could fade so gently into the past, then maybe we don't need to hold so tightly to our own noise, our own stresses. The world forgets even the grandest struggles. Yours too can be put down for the night. Picture it one last time, the ruins under the stars, the stones cooling in the evening air, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind brushing past. Once this was the centre of the world. Tonight it is only quiet, peaceful, still, and that stillness is yours too. Let your breathing slow to match it. Inhale, exhale, like the rhythm of centuries passing, like sand slipping through fingers, like the rise and fall of empires that no longer need your attention. If you're still awake now, that's all right. History is patient. It doesn't mind if you drift slowly. You can carry the ruins with you a little longer, or let them go entirely. Either way, the story has already done its work. It has filled the night with something softer than silence. So I'll leave you here, among the echoes of forgotten walls, under the stars that outlasted kings. Close your eyes, let the empire fade, let today fade. Good night, my friend, sleep well, and when the time comes, we'll meet again. In another story, another empire, another quiet night.